The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Rows of spectators filled the wooden benches, their whispered conversations creating a hushed murmur that ebbed and flowed like waves crashing against a distant shore. At the front of the room, seated at the defendant's table, was Marcus Carter. His dark brown eyes remained steady, betraying no emotion, though the weight of injustice pressed heavily on his chest. He had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in others like it, where the scales of justice never quite seemed balanced when a black man sat on trial. Today was no different. Across from him, standing tall and confident, were officers Brad Whitaker and Tom Reynolds, both in crisp uniforms, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They had the ease of men who had been through this process many times before, knowing that the system was built to protect them. At the elevated bench sat Judge Richard Holloway, his gavel resting within easy reach. He was a man of stature, his silver hair neatly combed back, his expression one of thinly veiled impatience. He had served on the bench for decades, long enough to believe in the infallibility of the officers who stood before him. From the very beginning, it was clear where his sympathies lay. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Holloway presiding. The audience quieted as the judge cleared his throat and peered down at Marcus over the rim of his glasses. "Let's get this over with." Marcus remained composed as the prosecutor. A young, ambitious attorney named Daniel Price stepped forward. He adjusted his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, the case before you today involves the unlawful arrest and use of excessive force against Mr. Carter. The evidence will show that Officers Whitaker and Reynolds—" Judge Holloway held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Price, let's not waste time with grandstanding," the judge said dismissively. "These officers were simply doing their duty. Unless you have something substantial, I suggest we move this along." A ripple of discomfort ran through the spectators. This wasn't a trial, it was a formality, a performance where the ending had already been written. Marcus clenched his jaw but remained silent. He had expected this. The prosecutor swallowed, pushing forward despite the judge's obvious bias. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to call the first witness." Judge Holloway sighed and nodded begrudgingly. "Proceed." Brad Whitaker was the first to take the stand. He straightened his uniform as he sat, exuding confidence. The prosecutor approached him. "Officer Whitaker, can you describe the events that led to Mr. Carter's arrest?" The officer cleared his throat, his voice smooth and practiced. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. When we arrived, we saw Mr. Carter standing outside a vehicle that fit the description of one reported stolen." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "And was the vehicle actually stolen?" Whitaker hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "At the time, we had reason to believe it was." Marcus fought back a bitter smile. His car, his legally owned vehicle. "And what happened next?" "Well," Whitaker continued, his tone matter-of-fact, "we approached Mr. Carter and asked him for identification. Instead of cooperating, he became hostile." A murmur ran through the audience. Several people exchanged skeptical glances. Marcus, still silent, allowed the lie to unfold. "Hostile?" the prosecutor pressed. Whitaker nodded. "He refused to provide ID, raised his voice, and became aggressive. We were left with no choice but to restrain him for our safety." It was the perfect script, designed to paint Marcus as the aggressor, the threat, the one who had forced their hand. The prosecutor exhaled sharply and turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce video evidence that contradicts Officer Whitaker's testimony." Judge Holloway barely looked interested. "Fine. Make it quick." A screen flickered to life. The courtroom watched as security footage from a nearby store played. It showed Marcus standing by his own car, keys in hand, when the officers approached. He reached into his pocket, presumably for his wallet, when one of the officers shoved him hard against the hood of his car. The footage showed them pinning him down, even as he remained motionless, before roughly slapping cuffs onto his wrists. There was no hostility, no aggression. Silence settled over the room. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses, shifting uncomfortably. "This doesn't show the full context," he muttered. "Maybe the defendant was resisting earlier." Marcus let out a quiet breath through his nose. He had seen this before. Evidence could be twisted. The truth could be ignored. And yet he remained calm, because the real moment of reckoning was coming soon. For now, he waited. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the courtroom as Officer Brad Whitaker straightened his uniform, adjusting his posture on the witness stand. He exuded the confidence of a man who had been in this position before, a man who knew exactly how to navigate the system. His partner, Officer Tom Reynolds, sat a few feet away, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Marcus Carter remained silent, his hands folded in front of him as he listened. He had no intention of interrupting, no matter how blatantly the truth was being twisted. Instead, he watched, calm, calculating, waiting. The prosecutor, Daniel Price, stepped forward, a legal pad in hand. "Officer Whitaker, let's go over this again. You claim that Mr. Carter was acting aggressively." Whitaker nodded, his expression serious. "That's correct. And by aggressive, you mean?" Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "When we approached him and asked for identification, he immediately became defensive. His tone was hostile. He refused to comply, and when we attempted to detain him for further questioning, he resisted." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the back, a group of black spectators exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard this narrative before. It was a script, a rehearsed justification, carefully worded to shift the blame onto the victim. Price frowned. "Officer, I'd like to remind you that we just watched video evidence contradicting that claim." Whitaker barely hesitated. "The footage doesn't capture the full sequence of events. What it doesn't show is Mr. Carter's initial reaction. The moment he saw us approaching, he stiffened. He reached for his pocket in a suspicious manner. We didn't know if he had a weapon." Price narrowed his eyes. "He was reaching for his wallet." Whitaker lifted a shoulder in a nonchalant shrug. "We had no way of knowing that at the time." At the defendant's table, Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. The weight of the officer's words pressed against him, not because he was surprised, but because he had seen how often this exact excuse was used. "I feared for my safety. I had no choice. He was acting suspicious." These words had sentenced innocent men before. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "Officer, in your experience, would you say Mr. Carter's behavior fit the profile of someone evading law enforcement?" Whitaker nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. He avoided answering our questions, refused to provide ID right away, and became combative when we tried to detain him." The judge nodded, barely concealing his approval. He turned to Marcus. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say in response?" Marcus stood slowly. His broad shoulders squared as he met the judge's gaze, but his expression remained composed. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to state for the record that I was never aggressive, nor did I resist in any way." Judge Holloway raised a skeptical brow. "The officers on the stand are sworn members of law enforcement. Are you suggesting they're lying?" Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm suggesting they're wrong." A few people in the audience chuckled quietly, but Holloway's face remained impassive. "Mr. Carter, you expect this court to believe that these experienced officers, men who put their lives on the line every day, somehow fabricated their account of what happened?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I expect this court to look at the evidence." The judge exhaled sharply. "Mr. Carter, your attitude is not doing you any favors. I strongly suggest you consider the seriousness of this situation before making any further statements." It was a warning one Marcus had heard before, a demand for submission, a reminder that the court was not built for men like him. But Marcus knew something the judge didn't. So, instead of pushing back, he simply nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied. He turned his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Price, unless you have something new to present, I don't see a reason to drag this out. The officers acted within their training. Let's move toward closing arguments. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The spectators who had hoped for a fair trial sat a little lower in their seats. The officers, sensing their victory, exchanged barely concealed smiles. A few men in the back, ones who had come in support of law enforcement, smirked as if this was nothing more than entertainment. Marcus could have spoken then. He could have argued, pointed out the flaws in their testimony, the inconsistencies in their statements. But he didn't, because the moment he was waiting for hadn't arrived yet. So instead, he sat back down, folded his hands once more, and simply waited. Let them think they had won. For now. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as Judge Holloway prepared to wrap up the proceedings. He had already made up his mind. In his eyes, this was just another routine case, an incident where law enforcement had done their job, and a black man had dared to challenge the system. But before he could deliver his ruling, Marcus Carter stood. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady but commanding. "Before we proceed any further, I believe it's time I properly introduce myself." Judge Holloway's brow furrowed in irritation. "Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular. We are moving toward closing arguments." But Marcus wasn't deterred. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. With practiced ease, he flipped it open and placed it on the table in front of him, the metallic badge inside glinting under the courtroom lights. The room went completely still. The golden emblem bore the unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice. Below it, in bold, capitalized letters, were the words, U.S. Attorney, Federal Prosecutor. Judge Holloway stiffened. Officer Whitaker paled. His partner, Officer Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The air in the room changed. What had once been a stacked deck in favor of the officers now felt like the beginning of an unraveling. Marcus let the moment stretch, allowing the weight of his revelation to settle. Then, in the same measured tone, he spoke. "My name is Marcus Carter," he said, his voice firm, each syllable deliberate, "and I am a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office." A sharp gasp rippled through the audience. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh, damn!" The black spectators sat up a little straighter, their eyes wide with astonishment. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, but there was an undeniable tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Mr. Carter, Marcus didn't let him finish. "For the past hour, I have sat here and listened as two officers perjured themselves in front of this court. I have listened as they twisted the facts of my arrest, fabricated my alleged aggression, and attempted to justify their abuse of power." Whitaker opened his mouth to object, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him with nothing more than a look. "And, Your Honor," Marcus continued, turning his attention back to the judge, "I have also watched as you dismissed video evidence, ignored blatant inconsistencies, and prepared to rule in favor of these men without so much as considering the possibility that I was telling the truth." Judge Holloway shifted in his seat, his face now noticeably flushed. "Now, Mr. Carter, I wasn't Mr. Carter to you 5 minutes ago," Marcus interrupted, his voice unwavering. "I was just another black defendant in your courtroom, wasn't I?" Holloway's mouth pressed into a thin line. He had no immediate response. Marcus took a step forward, his presence alone commanding the room. "I expected better from you, Judge," he said, "and I expected better from the justice system. But instead, what I got was exactly what every other black man in this country gets, a presumption of guilt." Reynolds, the second officer, suddenly stood. "This is absurd," he snapped. "This man was resisting arrest." Marcus turned sharply, his eyes locking onto him like a predator sizing up prey. "Resisting?" he repeated, his voice like steel. "Funny, because the security footage, which I personally subpoenaed from the building I was arrested in front of, tells a different story." He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a USB drive. "I have here unedited surveillance footage from the moment I stepped outside the cafe to the moment these officers put their hands on me." He turned to the judge. "Would you like me to submit this into evidence, Your Honor? Or are you still going to take their word over mine?" Judge Holloway hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. His previous confidence had crumbled, replaced by thinly veiled panic. "Submit it," he muttered. Marcus walked over to the bailiff and handed him the drive. Within moments, the footage was on display for the entire courtroom to see. The truth played out in crisp, high-definition clarity. The video showed Marcus standing outside the cafe, sipping his coffee, minding his own business. The moment Whitaker and Reynolds approached, he complied immediately, reaching for his wallet when asked, his movements slow and deliberate. Then came the damning moment. Whitaker suddenly shoved Marcus against the wall without provocation. Marcus didn't resist. He barely had time to react before they wrenched his arms behind his back. The video captured everything. The courtroom was silent as the footage ended. Officer Whitaker's face had drained of all color. Reynolds' jaw clenched. They both knew they had just lost any credibility they had left. Marcus turned back to the judge. "So tell me, Your Honor," he said, his voice razor-sharp. "Still think these experienced officers were telling the truth?" Judge Holloway's mouth opened, then closed. He had no words. Marcus nodded, as if he had expected this reaction. "That's what I thought." Then, for the first time, his expression hardened. "I am officially pressing charges against Officers Whitaker and Reynolds for false arrest, excessive force, and perjury. And since I am a federal prosecutor, I'll be making sure these charges stick." Whitaker shot to his feet. "Now wait just a damn. I'd sit down if I were you, officer," Marcus said coolly. "You're already in enough trouble." Reynolds yanked at his collar, sweat gathering at his temples. Judge Holloway, realizing he had completely lost control of the courtroom, cleared his throat and sat forward. "Mr. Carter, we will, of course, investigate these allegations." "No need," Marcus cut in. "I'll be handling the investigation myself." He turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Price, I'll be expecting your office's full cooperation." Daniel Price, who had spent most of the trial assuming Marcus was just another defendant, now looked as though he wished he had chosen his words more carefully. "Oh, of course." Marcus exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. The entire courtroom was still watching him in stunned silence. He had come in as a defendant. Now he was the one holding all the power, and he was far from finished. The weight of the revelation still hung in the air as the courtroom processed what had just transpired. Marcus Carter was no ordinary defendant. He was a federal prosecutor who had just exposed a blatant abuse of power before their very eyes. Judge Holloway, for the first time in years, appeared uncertain. His gavel, which once symbolized his absolute control over his courtroom, now felt like a meaningless prop in his hands. The very foundation of his authority had been shaken. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of composure. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice noticeably strained. "Given these new developments, the court will—" Marcus didn't let him finish. "Your Honor, no." His voice was firm but controlled. "This is no longer about new developments. This is about justice. You were prepared to rule against me, despite overwhelming inconsistencies in the officer's testimony. The only reason we're having this conversation is because I had to reveal who I am for you to even consider the truth." Judge Holloway shifted uncomfortably. Marcus stepped forward, addressing the entire courtroom. "How many others have stood in my place?" His eyes swept across the gallery. "How many innocent men have walked into this courtroom, knowing the odds were stacked against them, knowing their words meant nothing against the uniform of a police officer? How many have lost their jobs, their freedom, even their lives, because the system refused to see them as anything but guilty?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others whispered among themselves, but all of them knew the answer: too many. Marcus turned back to the judge. "Well, not today." He shifted his gaze to the prosecutor, Daniel Price. "Mr. Price, you represent the state. You now have clear, indisputable evidence that Officers Whitaker and Reynolds committed false arrest, perjury, and excessive force. What do you intend to do about it?" The prosecutor hesitated. Just an hour ago, he had been dismissive of Marcus, ready to let this case slide by as another routine hearing. But now, the tide had turned. And with Marcus Carter holding him accountable, he had no choice. Price swallowed hard and adjusted his tie. The state will conduct a full investigation into the officer's conduct. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's not good enough. Price flinched. You don't need an investigation, Marcus continued. You need action. Right now, you have enough to charge these officers for perjury alone. He turned to the bailiff. I request that these men be taken into custody immediately. Whitaker, who had been growing increasingly agitated, lost control. This is bullshit, he exploded, slamming his fist on the table. You can't do this. We're cops. Marcus turned to him, his expression one of cool indifference. And I'm a federal prosecutor. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts. The courtroom was alive with energy as people realized what was happening. For once, the script had been flipped. The men who had spent their careers wielding unchecked power were now the ones being held accountable. The bailiff looked at the judge for direction. Judge Holloway hesitated, but the weight of the room, the pressure of justice finally being served, left him with no other option. Officers Whitaker and Reynolds, you are hereby remanded into custody pending further proceedings. Bailiff, take them into custody. The officers' faces fell. Whitaker struggled as the bailiff grabbed his wrist. You're making a huge mistake, he shouted. You think you can just do this? You're just a... Marcus took a step closer, his voice low but lethal. I am an officer of the United States Department of Justice, and you are under arrest. Whitaker clenched his jaw, defeated. As the officers were escorted out of the courtroom, the silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, one by one, people stood. The black members of the audience were the first. A woman in the back wiped a tear from her eye before clapping once. Then again, and again. Soon, the room erupted into applause. For Marcus Carter, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about justice. It was about proving that no one, not even a judge, not even a cop, was above the law. He gathered his briefcase, adjusting his tie as he turned to leave. As he stepped out of the courtroom, a young black man stopped him near the door. Mr. Carter, the man said, eyes wide with admiration. I've never seen anything like that before. He hesitated before adding, I'm in law school right now. I hope one day I can do what you just did. Marcus smiled for the first time that day. He reached into his pocket and handed the young man his card. Then do it, he said. And if you ever need guidance, call me. The young man took the card as if it were gold. Marcus stepped into the hallway, exhaling deeply. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Justice was not a moment. It was a fight, and Marcus Carter was prepared to keep fighting. If you believe in justice and holding people accountable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.